It's so important for students to understand the abolitionist movement because the efforts, the strategies, and the ideologies that the abolitionists practice have set a really good model for how we understand social activism today. That if you were to fast forward 100 years to the civil rights movement, some of the same tactics and strategies were used during the abolitionist movement. It's a massive movement to abolish a massive system, and that there were people who were risking their lives and their well-being to make sure that slavery was overthrown, nonviolently if possible. And I think they are probably, to me, one of the most significant group of reformers that I've ever studied. Some of the things that the abolitionists do that I think we still do today is they understood the power of the press, and they used newspapers to get out and disseminate a lot of their ideas about why slavery was wrong. And they do that in some pretty remarkable ways. I think that when you think about David Walker, and he writes his famous appeal, and he makes sure that it goes all over the United States. And in that appeal, he's talking about why slavery is wrong. He's talking about why slavery is violent. He's talking about how it needs to be overthrown. Equally important, he's talking about how Black people are equal, right? And that they need to be acknowledged for their equal humanity. I think the work that abolitionists are doing is twofold. One, they are stressing the importance of not just emancipation, but immediate emancipation. We don't want it in 100 years. We don't want it next year. We want freedom now. That's really important. And then for Black abolitionists, they're really stressing emancipation, yes, because that's a good start, but also equality, that equality and emancipation have to go hand in hand. And the things that they do to really push those efforts, I think, are so remarkable. I tell my students about the Underground Railroad. I talk about how they help escaped slaves get to freedom or get to Canada. They have relief societies put in place so that when fugitive slaves get to the North, they have shelter, they have jobs, they have clothing, they have food. And they're constantly pushing a political agenda, making sure that politicians are hearing them so that legally things can change so that slavery can be overthrown. It's not just a social movement, it's an economic movement, it's a political movement, it's a moral movement.
Welcome back to a patron-only episode of the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. Today, I want to take up the topic of abolition and talk about abolition as a logic. And by a logic, I mean a framing, an approach, and almost an epistemological way of viewing the world that I think informs the kind of activism we want to engage in, but also the intellectual projects we engage in and the way that we orient ourselves in relation to each other and to systems of power, which we're obviously trying to dismantle. So I want to begin this discussion with sort of a recap of a conversation that Justin and I had back and forth about this idea of abolition versus defunding the police. And this argument, and it really shouldn't even be called an argument, but this discussion between Justin and I essentially was based on the type of rhetoric that we should use in order to try to win eventually. And just to quickly recap, my contention at the time, and what my contention remains, is that the abolish the police hashtag or abolish the police as a slogan isn't a great way to approach sort of the public relations side of what we're trying to do of our movement. And the reason for this is because I don't think it really wins anybody over who isn't already on board. And when I say already on board, I don't even mean here a leftist. I mean people who haven't engaged with the literature of what abolition means. So I think as an outward-facing approach, it's problematic to go out there and say, abolish the police. Because even a well-meaning progressive, even a well-meaning social democrat, even somebody who wants to fight the same fight that we want to fight, will ask the simple follow-up question of what replaces it. And my main problem here was that much of the response to that was extremely counterproductive in the sense that most people that I saw online pushing this slogan didn't have a good answer. So let me recap what I saw in several conversations, including big accounts on the left with blue checks. I remember particularly one being a Jacobin writer who is particularly popular on the left. And the exchange went like this, and this is a recap of several exchanges I saw, but this one specifically, right? So it comes out, the first tweet is, well, abolish the police. Push the slogan out, right? The follow-up from somebody who is skeptical, I don't know who, whether this person is a conservative, progressive, doesn't really matter. Their response was, okay, well, who's going to solve murders, or who's going to come when there's a robbery? And then the response after that, I think, is where you really lose the plot. Because the response after that is, police don't solve murders anyways. Which is true, right? If you look into the statistics of how good police are at solving murders, it's usually about rates of 50% in this country. So something like half, depending on the year, half of murders in this country are not solved by police. That's an insane number to really think about, and in some countries it's even lower. So from an empirical point of view, it is the case that police don't solve murders. But then what's the follow-up from the skeptic? The follow-up from the skeptic goes, okay, so 50% of murders go unsolved, so your solution is to have those other 50% go unsolved too? And then this is the point where the conversation really breaks down, or what you'd always see, or what I always saw online, and this includes both Twitter back and forth, but also basically argumentation in written articles in places like Jacobin would say, oh, you just need to go read Angela Davis and you'll understand what we're talking about. And to me, this is a massive failure. A left cannot win that when they advocate a position and get the slightest amount of pushback. And when I say the slightest amount of pushback, I mean the next logical question, the question that literally I myself would ask if I had not already read people like Angela Davis. The response from a reasonable pushback, from a logical pushback, from just following the logic of the thing that you said, right? Police don't solve 50% of murders, so abolishing them is somehow going to help this problem of only 50% of murders solved? And this is indicative of a bigger problem on the left, which you've probably seen caricatured online, but unfortunately it's a caricature that is very true, which is the read theory left. If you don't understand what's going on, you don't understand why I'm advocating this position, you don't understand why capitalism is bad, you don't understand how we can just get a revolution tomorrow, well, just go read theory. Go read Marx, go read Lenin, go read Angela Davis, go read Mao. And, I'm not some great consumer of theory, but I think I've done my fair share of theory reading at this point. And my takeaway from theory reading, essentially, is that it's really, really cool history. I like reading Lenin to some extent, because it's fun to see how Lenin thought during a historical period that was completely unique, in which he was trying to launch a revolution basically from scraps of a peasant population, trying to apply Marxist theory to a place where Marx did not want it to be applied. That's fascinating to me as a history. And it's fascinating to me as biography, as seeing how intelligent Lenin was and how much he did understand. But the idea that reading Lenin is going to allow us to unlock the key to a socialist revolution is quite silly. Or at least that's my takeaway. And I know some of you will disagree with me. I see it online every day. And it's also not to say that they don't have extremely important ideas, right? Like you should read Marx if you have the capacity, if you have the time. You should read Lenin if you have the capacity, if you have the time, right? When Lenin talks about imperialism, for example, it's a very, very good critique of the system as is. And that's especially what I love about Marx, is that Marx is almost like a scientist dissecting the system of capitalism. And it's really, really fun and useful to see the way that he sort of dissects the system and tears it apart and analyzes it. And that's useful. That's very, very useful. But it's not the end-all, be-all for how we're supposed to act in the modern world. And again, just like take the logic at face value. The idea that people 150 years ago had the keys to unlocking our revolutionary movement is just not a solid proposition. And it seems to me this is mostly a reflection of our powerlessness. That power seems so far away and so impossible to think of a revolutionary movement in the United States when the government has so much power and there's so much inequality and private capitalists control our daily lives. Power seems so far away, and in some ways it is. But what people do is substitute knowledge for power in terms of, oh, you haven't read Marx? Well, you're not as powerful as me because I understand this stuff better. And in this sense, I advocate for some kind of a new left. And a million things have been called the new left, so I'm not tying myself to any modern movement. But what I'm saying is we need to rebuild ourselves, reconstitute ourselves, and think in different ways if we're going to succeed. But because it's comfortable to retreat into the past of people who have had success, of Russian revolutionaries who did it, then it seems like that's the best place to go, that we're grounded in a real movement because those people had real success. But again, the conditions were so different. If you even just take Marx at face value, the idea that material conditions determine outcomes, and think that a peasant revolution in Russia holds the key to a globalized, industrialized country in the way that we can overthrow the system, you're going to lose. We have to build new systems of thought, and new systems of symbols, and new systems of power. And so when Justin and I had that debate, one thing that he said in the middle of it that really clicked with me was that we're working in an abolition framework. And that is a key lesson. Because to me, working in an abolition framework, maybe counterintuitively, means actually discussing defunding the police as opposed to abolishing the police, simply because that's going to be a more effective rhetorical tool. Not just to win over our opposition, but I think that defund the police contains within it more of what we actually want to see than abolish the police. And in this episode, I'm going to try to spell out the reasons why and hopefully open up sort of a new frontier of ways to think about these things. So I want to start that discussion with the criticisms of people like AOC on this very issue. So what AOC would say time and time again is that we're going to defund the police and use that money on public education, or a few times she said funding healthcare expansion. And this was very informative because the critique of her from these sort of progressive wonk types, people like Destiny was a big one, people like David Pakman, people like Ben Burgess, thought they had a slam dunk case against AOC and that AOC was being stupid because what she was saying is we're going to fund education, which costs tens of billions of dollars, with police budgets, which are much less than that. So the critique straightforwardly went, oh, AOC's out here talking about shifting police funding to fund education, but it wouldn't even pay for a fraction of the cost of what education would actually cost. And here I'm going to introduce, as I will a lot in coming episodes, the idea of modern monetary theory, or MMT, which is exactly the approach that AOC was drawing on. And AOC fully understands MMT because the Green New Deal has MMT at its foundation, which is to say, very quickly, and just for the record, I will be doing a MMT explainer on the main feed soon. MMT tells us that governments print money and then create demand from that money printing through taxation. So, in other words, the traditional economic model, the way that you probably, just as a baseline, think about the world right now, because it's sort of the propaganda form of mainstream economics, is to say, we get tax revenue in, we tax billionaires and we get some revenue from them, and then we put that money back out in terms of spending. And that relationship, MMT shows us, is just fundamentally backwards. The money always comes from the government first. The government prints money, it creates demand, and then it collects revenue. So again, printing first, revenue second. Demand created by the government first, tax dollars in second. And in fact, we don't need those tax dollars to come in order to spend. The only thing that a government deficit is a record of all the debts of private spending. And this has three major radical implications, both just in terms of government policy, but also I believe, in the way that we view the world. We view social relations. We view the role of being a public that is in relation to one another. The first is simply that deficits and government debt don't matter. The only thing that matters is inflation, which is just simply when prices rise such that you can't afford the things that you need. 2, the only constraint on government spending is productive capacity in the economy. In other words, what you and I can produce. And we're nowhere near that at this point in time. We should be spending a lot more. And then 3, and maybe most importantly, money is boundless, and we can create any world we want to see through the provisioning of money. We can recreate social relations by using public money, which is what money is. It's a public good, to redefine the structure of production. This is why the jobs guarantee is such a radical proposal. So just very quickly, the way a jobs guarantee would work is essentially like a public option in the labor market, where the government would have a set of jobs, which of course would be of the public interest, and we want to democratize this as much as possible. So we decide the jobs we want to see, which of course are going to include things like arts and literature, these types of public goods that we all value. We determine the type of labor we want to produce those things, and we set the wage rate. And so with a jobs guarantee, you have a government public option program in which anybody can take a job, a public job from the government, which doesn't have a profit motive and thus isn't trying to satisfy squeezing the most out of its workers or pleasing shareholders, is simply in the interest of the public. And you also set a wage rate on that job, which essentially nullifies the need for a minimum wage. Because anybody being paid under, say, $15 from this jobs guarantee program would just go work for the jobs guarantee program, would just go work for the public good for that $15 rate. So circling back to AOC, these type of logics are the thing that she's employing when she's talking about defunding the police and paying for public education. She's not laying out an Excel spreadsheet and saying, okay, in this row is revenue and this row is spending. We're going to take the revenue away from the police and spend it over here. What she's saying is we need to fund public education with public dollars. And we also want to shift social relations as part of that process away from police. We want our society to be more educated and less policed. And therefore, the concept is we defund the police to fund education, not through accounting, but through social relations, that we lessen the power of the police, that we restrict the jurisdiction of the police, that we redefine what quote-unquote policing means, if we even want to call it that anymore, that we take former police officers and put them in different positions to a more societally equitable end. And through that process, we also want to fund education and childcare and medical care. And we're tying these things together because they currently represent a bad system of social relations where we police the shit out of children that are uneducated oftentimes, and we don't fund their schooling. We want to shift this dynamic, shift this relationship. We also want these people, when they're children, to have good care. That through this process, we're going to restrict the need for criminality, restrict the need for the creation of alternative economies that arise when people don't have access to jobs. That's the thing that AOC is pushing. That's the thing that MMT offers. And that's the thing that is misunderstood by this progressive wonk class who does spreadsheet economics, who says there's a row for spending and there's a row for revenue, and we need to line them up. Or maybe we can have a little bit of deficits, but ultimately our goal in a healthy economy is to have them line up. That's absolutely not our goal. It doesn't even make sense as a goal once you understand MMT. And the concept I want to bring up at this point is this relationship between base and superstructure. Because for a lot of socialists and Marxists hearing these words, and people that have critiqued MMT popularly, like Doug Henwood in Jacobin Magazine or Matt Bruenig, will say that this is all just superstructure nonsense. So let me explain what I mean. Under the Marxist framework, there's a base and a superstructure, and they're in dialectical relationship. The base is just simply the means of production. These are labor arrangements. This is who owns and who works. Very simply, this is the means of production. And then the superstructure, and the way that Marx literally diagrams it, which is actually telling, is the superstructure is everything that lays on top of the base. So this is law and media and aesthetics and art and culture and family and religion. And so to a lot of the Marxist left, the only thing that matters is the base. The only thing that matters is production. We can't talk about superstructure because that's all just the way that owners manipulate society towards their own ends. That the bourgeois use the legal system, use the media to entrench their own power. And so the only purpose of the superstructure under the schema is as another tool of oppression, to go down to the base where workers are oppressed and to reinforce that oppression. That's the only role of the superstructure. My personal belief is that Marx and MMT fit together quite nicely in so many different ways, but the way that Marxists often see this is that MMT is just part of superstructure in two ways. One, it deals with money, which is part of the superstructure in and of itself. And two, MMT sees the superstructure as equally important and inseparable from the base. So in some ways, in terms of the philosophy of MMT and many of the people who advocate it, it can be seen as like a Frankfurt School 2.0, because the Frankfurt School came along after Marx, people like Adorno, and discussed things like art and aesthetic and the way that they influence the base. The Frankfurt School was the first to say that vulgar Marxism that just focuses on the base, which I have to note is a shit ton of the modern left today, is misguided, and that superstructure really, really matters. MMT is in that same philosophical tradition, or at least the interpretation that I'm advocating today. Because MMTers say you can't talk about the means of production without talking about the way that governments create legal charters. The primary one being where money goes, which generates demand. So MMTers are saying, how could this possibly be separate from the base? And let me just be very clear about this. So again, the government prints money, it releases money into the economy, and then it places a tax on that money to create demand, right? So I desire this money because I have to pay it back in taxes. That's the way demand is created. And the best way to sort of dissect this is just to think about early America paying for the war effort, or even World War II. The government created all this demand for all the tools necessary for war, and then tax that money supply. And then again, as I talked about in the previous episode, they literally burned that money. They literally stuck all that money into a furnace so it wouldn't stay in the economy. But the important point here is that the government creates demand. And it seems a lot more opaque and complicated now because the economy is obviously much more diverse than it was in early America, but it's the exact same principle. The government has decided which jobs it wants to invest in. The government has decided which forms of production it wants to invest in. The government has decided who works and who doesn't by setting a quote-unquote natural unemployment rate. And what's being argued here is that this stuff matters just as much as class struggle matters. And of course, nobody is ignoring the importance of class struggle and labor unions and organization. But we also have this other tool. So when people say nationalize fossil fuels, or nationalize the energy industry writ large, or nationalize utilities, what's essentially being said in that statement is that we want to build a new social relationship where the provisioning of this good, which came from public money, as all goods do, as all demand in the economy does, we want to actually be used for public good, for a new kind of social relation in which we recognize that we collectively need to produce some level of energy to survive on this planet, and we want that to be democratized and in the service of the public instead of shipped off to private hands of capitalists to make those decisions. That's what nationalization means. And what this recognizes, back to the topic of abolition, is that we can't see society in segments. So just to say abolish the police and mean it, just to say we should completely get rid of this particular institution, is to miss the boat in some ways. And missing that boat is missing the dialectical relationship between the police and everything else in society, between the police and social workers and teachers and the education system writ large, and culture and families and the way these things all interact. The reason why I like defund the police, which again, as Justin noted in that podcast, is under an abolition framework, is to say, when we say defund the police and we talk about shifting funds elsewhere, we're not talking about an accounting trick. We're talking about shifting social relations elsewhere. So think about the case of prisons, right? It's the case that society reinforces prisons, but it's at the exact same time the case that prisons reinforce society, that our modes of interacting with each other and what we think punishment means, and how we think of authority, and how we think of school, and the school to prison pipeline comes from a culture that isn't a thing that happens in isolation. That's not police going in this sort of material relationship and saying, where are the bad kids, and pulling them out of school. No, it's something that affects society writ large, that both has things that lead to it and things that it leads to, in terms of it affects the way that we parent. It affects the things that we let our children do. It affects what we're afraid of. It affects how we practice our religion. It affects the way we think of crime and the way we consume media. All these things are intertwined, and then you get systems where an 18-year-old can essentially go straight from school to prison. That's not an isolated event. And this dialectical view, I think, changes just slightly the reform or revolution question that Rosa Luxemburg is asking. And what Rosa Luxemburg says is that when I say reform or revolution, I'm basically saying the or tongue-in-cheek, that we need to engage in reform, but it has to be in the service of revolution. That the idea of jumping straight to revolution without reforms is not going to work. But if we simply reform without the context of revolution, we're also not going to achieve our goals. We might create a world that's marginally better, but we'll never get anywhere close to where we want to be. And I want to tweak that slightly in the context of this conversation to say there are essentially two components to this sort of logic that I'm constructing, which is abolition and reconstruction. But in our heads, we tend to think of one coming after the other, that you abolish these institutions, and not just these institutions, but you abolish these ideas and these modes of thinking, and then you reconstruct society in the way that you want to see it. But if we're thinking like good Hegelians, neither comes prior to the other, and that's true. You can't abolish something without having a vision of how to reconstruct it. But you can't reconstruct it without having abolished it. And so neither is prior to the other. And that's uncomfortable in some sense because we want to think in a linear fashion, and we want to abolish the police, and then we want to reconstruct society. These things have to be done at the same time in a very confusing dance between the two that constantly goes back and forth, where you're never really doing one or the other. You're doing both identically because you can't have one without the other. They have to be engaged in at the exact same time. I think this dialectic can be explained in sort of analogy to a lifestyle change. If you want to quit smoking, it doesn't do just to not put a cigarette in your mouth. There's the abolition component of that behavior, which is stopping smoking cigarettes. But then there's the reconstruction part of that behavior, which is being the type of person who quits smoking cigarettes. And you can't quit smoking cigarettes without being the type of person who doesn't smoke cigarettes. You have to engage in both of these things at the same time. I think we kind of understand this in terms of lifestyle changes. They're never linear, and you never really think of one before the other. When you hear former addicts talk about their life change, the constant struggle is being uncomfortable in this contradiction. That it's not enough just to stop drinking. You have to be a person who doesn't drink. And so you have to wrestle with these things all the time. And then sometimes one dominates the other. But in reality, the way to move forward on a daily basis is to have balance between the two. And these are generally non-linear relationships. In fact, not generally, they're always non-linear relationships. History does not progress in a linear fashion. That's a modern idea, and it's never been true, and it remains untrue. And this is how politics work too. There's no linear nature to politics. It doesn't all move in one direction at a consistent pace. But our minds are structured to make things linear. And this leads itself to two prominent attitudes on the left, where we're either weirdly triumphalist about all we need to do is rise up and overthrow, property owners, and life in 10 years will get better, or we can elect somebody slightly left of Bernie Sanders and suddenly life will be as we want it to be, or a complete pessimism because when you think in a linear fashion, it looks like we're nowhere fucking close. That we couldn't possibly imagine having true power in society because we're so out of power now. What even is the first step? We're structured for a linear view of the world, but we can't even see where the kickoff point is. I think that's where doomerism comes from. And what we need to understand is that politics is nonlinear, and it's also stochastic, meaning that it's random. Random things happen within the system that we cannot possibly prepare for, and we can't possibly have known beforehand, and that is decidedly nonlinear, that it was unpredictable. But we also have agency in these moments to take advantage of the random nature. Randomness, at least in this point in history, is extremely good for us because in a linear sense, we're way, way off. But random things happen, and it's our job to be set up to take advantage of them. So we saw, going back to Lenin in the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks go through a series of blind good luck that weakened the state and empowered them and made them more popular in just the moment that they were ready to take advantage of that. But that's because they started organizing a decade earlier. They were ready to go. They ran strategically in the Duma to gain a voice. They had papers out there publishing. Again, this is superstructure. This is media. This is what a lot of modern leftists in the service of Lenin reject, that we shouldn't have all these fancy dancy publications that want to talk about high level ideas because it's all about just, whether you're being exploited at work or not. They were set up to take advantage of what were a series of random events that could not have possibly been predicted, mostly as a result of World War I. And so just think, this isn't sort of in service of this broad abolition, revolutionary type discussion that we're having here. But think about Trump having COVID and think if he would have died. What a spontaneous, stochastic moment that would have been. That was completely unpredictable. I mean, obviously it was predictable that he could have got COVID the way that he was traveling around the country, but the president dying at the peak of both his neuroses playing out in front of all of our eyes and our obsession with it, and the entire political culture having been embodied through him. Now imagine if Bernie Sanders or somebody left of Bernie Sanders had been the person that was running against him. These are the type of moments that it's hard to even predict because they're unpredictable, they're stochastic, they're random, but that clearly could have led to a massive moment. And maybe that massive moment is just that, like, Trump dies and then candidate Bernie Sanders benefits from that, gets a massive windfall, has a massive Senate majority, and gets to pass all this legislation. Who knows, right? FDR's moment was unpredictable. FDR came in not expecting to be who he was as president. He didn't run as a social democrat or a progressive even. In fact, for much of his campaign, he ran on a center-left plank. And then all of a sudden, he is trying to fix the world through Keynesian spending. Politics is random. But the key there was that when FDR was in a position where he had a massive, massive majority in Congress, and he was facing a crisis that he had to fix, or else people were going to die and starve to death, the left was there at every step pressuring him. Labor movements had built up for years. And this is where base and superstructure cannot be seen as separate. One way to think about this by analogy is the Martin Luther King Jr. approach versus Malcolm. We need both in terms of MLK was in the White House pressuring LBJ, having conversations, making concessions to him in some ways, while Malcolm was out rallying communities for a violent working class uprising. And the pressure put on the system by both of them in different ways, and the pressure they put on each other, the pressure that Malcolm put on MLK to be more radical, while MLK put pressure on Malcolm to actually have influence within the mainstream of the system by being less radical. Those type of tensions in relations in terms of we are engaging with power on the one hand, and we're also completely separate with power and forming a whole different division of power that can put the government class in danger by having a massive working class angry movement that might be willing to take up arms. Those type of diffuse but cohesive at the same time movements that engage with each other and also engage with the system, this is the type of approach we need to take. This is the way that we need to think about things. This is how we take advantage of these random moments, these non-linear moments that give us an unexpected gap with which we can fill. And so this is where the idea of abolition to me is so important, because abolition is both a rejection of establishment structures that are material in terms of things like wage relations and economic inequality, but also immaterial in the sense of ideas. So one thing that needs to be abolished, in addition to the sort of cop form, the form that policing takes in the United States, the idea of policing, its mechanisms that it uses, the whole concept of American policing needs to be abolished. We need to abolish that type of thinking. We need to abolish the type of thinking that says that we need to extract from communities, or we need to control communities, or we need to do both control and extraction from communities. We also need to abolish the logic of scarcity, which drives so much of this. The scarcity mindset in our society is what drives exclusion, not just in production, but in social relations. This is where part of this base-obsessed, material relations-obsessed part of the left actually scares me. Because they do things like say we need to have coalitions with the right, which means we need to do a little bit of exclusion in order to get them on board our agenda. That we need to be exclusionary of certain groups. Yes, maybe we should have a strong border, but still have socialism within that border. Our Medicare for All isn't going to include things that are optional, and I'm doing heavy finger quotes that you can't see, like transgender realignment surgery. Or we need to deny it to people who come here, quote unquote, illegally. These are all based on conceptions of scarcity, and this is the point that Marxism just flat out misses. This is the problem with Marxism, and especially in its what's called its vulgar sense. That people accept the production schema as it is and think the best that we can do is to simply redistribute that. But since we have scarce resources, some people are going to need to be excluded. We can't have everybody. Not everybody can be included. And here is the point of MMT that is a radical divergence, and I think an important divergence from Marxism that rejects that very logic. There is no such thing as scarcity. And because there's no such thing as scarcity, because money is infinite and boundless and simply a creation of what a society, a public, and yes, we know at the current time it's not being controlled by the public in any way, but money is a public good. It's not a private good. That because that's the case, we can include everybody and we must include everybody. There need not be any exclusion. And every leftist will tell you they believe that. But when you engage in this type of scarcity logic, which is most people, you're implicitly saying that people are going to have to be excluded. Because in our current production makeup, we simply don't have enough for every single person. And you'll hear right-wingers say this all the time, that even if you taxed every billionaire at X rate, you'd only raise this much revenue. They're right. We can't tax our way to utopia. But we also don't need to. And this is the fakeness, which is like one of the key concepts on the left, that money is the root of all evil. And they believe that because they see money not as a public good, which it is, which I'm going to keep saying over and over again, but as a private good, as essentially the outcome of capitalists stealing our surplus value. That money is just a representation of workers being exploited, basically. That is empirically wrong. That's not what money is. And it's easy to think that way because, of course, that's how money is used. A bunch of our public money gets siphoned into the private market, and it seems like money is an evil that capitalists use to exploit us. But that's not what money actually is. It's a public good. So the idea that they have, quote, the money is a myth. And when we say that, when we say billionaires have the money, we reify the idea that there's some limited amount of money that is held in private hands and they have it. And the only way we can get it is to take from them. You cannot tax your way to utopia. An important lesson in MMT is that we don't need Jeff Bezos' money. And some of you may have perked up at that, right? Well, are you saying that we shouldn't tax Jeff Bezos? No, we should tax Jeff Bezos. We should tax him because he has too much power in society, because he has too much market power, and we want to redistribute power. But we're not taxing him to get his tax dollars so that we can balance a budget, so that we can balance a revenue sheet. That's what we're saying when we say that we need to tax Jeff Bezos. We're saying that we need to fill out that spreadsheet. That's fundamentally a myth. We don't need Jeff Bezos' money. We should take Jeff Bezos' money to redistribute his power, but it's not about the revenue that's raised because of that. In fact, some MMT economists point out that at the current rate, we might be taxing too much out of the system, actually. So the response there, importantly, and listen closely here, the response there is that we should lower taxes on middle-class people and raise taxes on Jeff Bezos. Now, I'm not sure if this is actually empirically correct. This is going to differ. It doesn't really matter, right? Because it's going to differ in the near future, right? And sometimes we're going to need more tax revenue to pull out of the private market. Sometimes we're going to need less. But what we should do in that context is we should lower taxes on middle-class people and raise them on rich people. But again, the key is not to raise revenue. The point is not that we need more tax dollars. The point is we want people to have less money, because them having more money means they have more power over us. That's an extremely important thing to internalize. So again, just to reiterate, money is a public good by definition. It comes from the government. It's a public good. And we need to not reify its private nature. Money is not what private capitalists create when they exploit you. And what money is a mediation tool for social relations and social organization. And that mediation tool in our current hell world has been used to give wealthy people a bunch of money. And the thing to note here too, in case anybody is confused, MMT is not a theory about how we want the world to be. It's a theory of how the world actually operates, right? So money as a mediation tool means that in its current state, money has been used to give wealthy people all the power and prestige in society. So think about it this way to try to further cement this. I'm going to use an example from Warren Mosler. And the way that Warren Mosler describes this is he pulls a card out of his wallet, right, his business card, and he says, "Who would like to clean this room in exchange for my business card?" And of course, nobody raises their hand because why would you do such a crazy thing? But now he provides an alternative scenario where he says, okay, well, there's only one way out of here. You got to walk out that door. And behind that door is a guy with a machine gun. And the only way that you can leave this room is if you give him my card. Well, now you've created demand for that card because people got to get out of the room. And that's how government creates demand for money. It's as simple as that. And so what you can see there, of course, is that the type of things that need to be done in exchange for that business card to get out of the room are purely a choice of the monopolist of money, the one entity that creates money, which is the government. And obviously, in a democratic system, that means it's public. And so we get to decide, theoretically, obviously this doesn't play out in practice, but this is the world that we want to strive for. We get to decide what we want everybody in that room to do to be able to leave that room after having demand for the card. We can make everybody be a janitor and clean the room till it's crystal clean. Or we can make everybody in the room create an art project. Or we could have everybody in the room do something completely different from one another. And so the important thing here is that MMT is recognizing and trying to expand the idea that money is endogenous. And what I mean by endogenous is self-contained. It's part of the system. So let me explain this really quickly. If you're doing statistical work and you're trying to figure out the effects of education on wages, the way that you would set up that equation, right? On the left side, you have wages, and then on the right side, you have education, and then you'd have gender and race and things like that to control for. All those things are endogenous to the model that I just mentioned. So gender is endogenous to the model, race is endogenous to the model, how many years of education you got is endogenous to the model, and your wages is endogenous to the model. They're all being explained within the model. What's exogenous to the model is, say, broader economic changes. So if you're running that same study of the effect of education on wages, it's going to be different during the Great Recession as 5 years prior. That's an exogenous shift. It's not accounted for within your model. And so what mainstream economists and Marxists do with money is they treat it as exogenous. They treat it as something that we cannot control. It's just there. And in many ways, Marxists treat it as a massive constraint. That money is, again, the root of all evil. It's the thing holding us back. It's what allows capitalists to have so much power over us. And there's nothing that we can do really to control it. We can shift production. We can take over production. But eventually we want to get rid of money because money is this exogenous thing that controls us. Again, that's empirically false. That's not the way that the world actually works when you have a government that prints money and you live in a democracy. So the more endogenous that we can see money, meaning the more control that we as individuals have over how it's spent, means the more we can reorganize how our society functions. As Michael Hudson states it, money is an inalienable public utility that can always be mobilized to meet social and ecological needs. And obviously that ecological point is extremely important. This is the importance of the Green New Deal, that we need to marshal society's resources, ignoring this pseudo bullshit deficit, in order to solve this climate crisis, in order to control this climate crisis, is the more accurate way of saying it. And even if you're somebody who believes change is only going to come when we have a revolution in the base from production, in the meantime, to have a planet that is going to survive to that point, we're going to need to marshal the power of money, the boundlessness of money, and the public nature of money to decide, which we can do. That's all we have to do is decide as a public that we're going to mitigate this crisis. And my perspective is that in doing so, we can utilize these same mechanisms to move towards revolution that includes the superstructure and the base, that helps us revolutionize society by shifting the priorities through things like a job guarantee that are going to set us up as a platform to own the means of production as a public, as a we rather than an I. And one thing I think to note in this context, because a lot of people will hear MMT and just say, oh, we can just spend whatever we want, right? And we're constrained by productive capacity. Productive capacity is kind of like the speed limit that we have to abide by. But I think some people will misinterpret this as sort of a push for a fully automated luxury communism. And I wanted to note very clearly that I reject that kind of thinking, and I would suggest that everyone else should too. Because fully automated luxury communism first reifies scarcity. The claims of those who are pushing fully automated luxury communism say that essentially we can use this modernist technology to go find other resources elsewhere. Aaron Bastani says literally mining other planets. And then we can bring that back so that there's abundance, right? So that reifies scarcity. That says we don't have enough right now, but we can go find enough elsewhere, bring it back in, and therefore everybody can have what they want. At the same time, though, that it reifies scarcity, it also reifies conspicuous consumption, because the push from a lot of the people in this movement and the idea of luxury is that we essentially want to all live like rich people. We want to live like the rich people in our current society. That is a complete lack of imagination, ironically, in the context of fully automated luxury communism. It's a lack of imagination of the way the world can actually be better, which is to say that under a system of socialism, we don't have to constrain ourselves in terms of we can have all our needs taken care of and we can have our wants taken care of. But the goal is not to live like kings. The goal is not jacuzzi hot tubs for all. And the reason why is because we are trying to rebuild social relations as part of this process, which I say socialism is a process. It's not an outcome. And so through that process, we need to determine the best ways to relate with one another. The best ways to relate with one another are not going to be all living like rich people, all living in private mansions or something like that, right? They're going to be communal bonds that form between people. And how that looks, we don't know, right? It's going to take a different form in every society. It might take a different form at local levels. But the idea is that it is a social production. It's a social relation between people. And part of this project is trying to rebuild those social relations and not to forget about this part. And that's what you forget about, I think, when you look at just the base, when you look at just redistributing production, when you look at just worker co-ops or people taking over their workplace. You ignore the superstructure aspect of that, which is things like family, which is things like culture, which is things like aesthetics. What kind of movies do we want to make in the future? And for this perspective, for my perspective, the type of movies that are produced in society tell us a shit ton about the type of production we have and the type of relations we have. It's extremely important. So even something that seems as much of a distraction maybe as the type of movies that are produced or the type of arts that are produced or the type of music that is produced, to me is extremely important. At the very least, it's a reflection, but I also think that it plays into production itself. And so this movement says we need to reincorporate the superstructure, build new cultures, and build new social relations. We're not just redistributing the goods created under our current capitalist economy, which I swear is what a lot of people push for. And again, the way to think about this is that money is the mediator of social relations, and we want to reshape it rhizomatically. When I say rhizomatically, I mean organically and from the bottom up, but not just from the bottom up, but also horizontally, right? Like a tree root system is the analogy to use here with the rhizome, that we're not trying to rebuild a hierarchy, that we're not trying to build a dualist system where it's one or the other. We're trying to build something organic and interactive between both quote unquote peers, but also from the bottom up. And so I want to conclude this podcast by talking about abolition as a verb. Abolition is something that you engage in. It's not an idea, it's not static, it's dynamic, and it's the way that we need to view the world. And an important point here is that abolition should reject teleology, meaning it should reject the idea that we're engaged in a linear type system that has some set end goal in mind. Abolition and reconstruction means that it's a process, and the process is the outcome. The act of engaging in this transformational process is the outcome. To me, that's what socialism means. It's not an equation. It's not a teleology that ends in a certain outcome. It's social relations between people who are redefining what it means to be in relation to one another. Okay, meditation over. I will talk to you next time. Bye.